Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Cook Financial Group in the BULLpen session, AI 101 Basics. We are excited to have you all here. I would like to start off by introducing Matt LeBlanc. If you've attended one of our sessions before, we really like these to be educational sessions, and we like to bring in an expert to talk about a specific topic. AI is everywhere in the news. It is a question that we are constantly getting questions around. How do we use AI? How do you use AI? What do we think is the future of AI? And so we thought no one better than Matt from Columbia Threadneedle to kind of join us today. So Matt is one of the portfolio managers on the equity team, specifically focused kind of with the technology stocks. And so, Matt, I think I will kind of just turn it over to you. Let's start with literally the topic of the conversation, right? What is AI? Just give us the basics of what it is and how you're viewing it today, please.
Thank you guys all for the support. Really excited to be here for you and really just give you kind of a high level, really overview on how we think about AI as an asset manager. Really, from kind of the bottom up, really what is AI? Where was it originated? Kind of how was it founded? How can you use it in your day-to-day lives? How might you be using it without even really realizing it right now? And then, as we know, this is kind of an investing opportunity. And so we'll kind of finish by taking a look at maybe some of the sectors right now that you'll see and hear about in the news that are really being heavily influenced by AI. But I think what's really exciting about AI being rolled out more across the globe is really these other sectors that it's eventually going to touch, and some of these other spaces that can benefit from AI use really outside of tech. But I think when we start about just with AI, what it is in general, I always kind of like to start with the definition, because when you think about artificial intelligence, the definition is really the ability of machines to imitate human intelligence. That's things like learning, reasoning, and making reasonable decisions. So that's kind of the crux of the definition. It's not magic or anything behind the scenes. It's really just the result of, really large, massive data sets combined with predictive algorithms. So when you think about it, most AI models really rely on data classification to generate predictions and responses. So when you think about something like a large language model, really what that is that's essentially a process to search the entire internet for data that an AI program will undertake. It will reference, classify all of that data when given a prompt or question. It will look through things like text images, videos, documents, everything in fractions of a second. And then it will really start to quickly kind of classify that data. So that's the next step in kind of this entire, package or this entire process. And what it will do is it'll enable and use that data to make a prediction. So that's what the output is based on. So at its core, really AI is just taking a massive amount of data set that's out there in the market, using a prompt or a question that you're asking the large language model, you're asking the search function, you're asking whatever, you might be looking for. It's going to scan the internet in a rapid amount of time for all of the potential articles, images, text related to that question. It's going to classify everything together, and then it's going to use that to actually generate a response to you. So for example, if we think about, a question like, what was the best performing sector of the S&P 500 last year? That AI program will pull a large amount of data, stock returns, sector returns, everything like that for the S&P 500. And then it will prompt out that response and say to you, technology or comm services or financials was the best performing sector of the market last year. So, at its core, it's not overly complicated. It's not, overly in the weeds. It's really kind of predicting, grabbing a large amount of data, and then classifying it in the correct way to make a decision from there. And so when we think about, really how we've progressed, I think that's probably what's the most unique to this, is that we think about kind of in just over a decade, AI has progressed really from kind of a simple recognition concept to complex generative AI. And that's the big term that you'll continue to hear in the market, which has really rapidly moved us, along so quickly over the last 2 or 3 years. And so if we think about this example from a yearly AI competition that we went back and looked at, and for some reason AI and cats have always gone very well together. When you look at what we see here, we look at researchers found a way to ask kind of the AI program, what is this? And the computer was able to locate it. It was able to answer that that's a cat. Then they asked, where is the cat? So it went from classification of recognizing it's a cat to then actually localization and recognition of where the cat is. So that's kind of the beginning of this whole AI revolution, really when we all started to take shape. But what would let us really now is the ability for AI to generate an entire video of a cat using a human written prompt. And so that's where we've really moved on from, is kind of from the classification level of AI to today, which is complete AI generation. So you can use AI to generate photos for you. You can use it to generate videos. You can use it to write research reports. You can use it to write emails. So, initially we went from kind of just this classification tool to now it is a fully generative AI agent that you can use to really help in your everyday life, to help make life easier and to help you kind of deal with, tasks that traditionally would have taken a little bit longer, that you can kind of use your AI program now to make your lives a little bit easier. And so, when we think about, where people use AI, I like to kind of go through this slide. And, a lot of times I'll do this in person. So for those of you guys who are out there on the webinar, maybe I'll ask you to kind of keep an open mind and pretend like we were in person here. But as we go through this slide, if I'm in person, usually what you can see is, kind of the statistics and the survey that we took over time. But, what I usually ask is, how many of you in the last week think that you've used AI in your everyday life? And usually I'll get about a third of the room will say so, that they've used AI. You can see about 36% here. I'll ask, after that, how many of you are kind of unsure if you've used AI? And usually we'll get about, 1 out of every 10 people, 1 out of every 15 people will say kind of they're unsure of whether they've used it or not. Then I'll ask, how many of you believe that you haven't used AI? And usually that's when I'll get about half the room will raise their hand and say that they haven't used AI in the last week. Now, what's really interesting is when I go through this and talk about the reality, the reality is about 99% of people that we gave this survey to have used AI in the last week. And I think what people don't realize is how many different functions you see it on a day-to-day basis, especially when it's something as simple as picking up your iPhone. So when you think about any use of, personal virtual assistants, Amazon Alexa, Siri, Google Gemini, Microsoft, any of those functions are pulling from an AI program. Navigation apps, as simple as a navigation app. We'll talk a little bit about why that is, because what we've seen from navigation apps, if you have, old school like a Garmin, is you would put it in an address and it would take you there. Now, what do we see with navigation apps? I'm sure you guys have realized this for those of you that have Google Maps. When you open up your phone, what you're seeing is it's going to start to recommend places for you to go as you've been there more, as your schedule, it starts to adopt to what you do on a daily basis. So, if you're someone that likes to stop at Starbucks on the way to work, it'll recommend that to you automatically. The example I like to give is when I pull up my Google Maps, it always recommends me to go to my country club. Not sure that my wife loves that, but I always like to say that that's kind of where it always takes me. But things like weather forecasting apps, especially if you're using a navigation system, so it's automatically pulling where you are in the world to give you the weather based on your location right there. Social media apps, when you look at things like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, all of the advertisements that are pushing through on those sites. Streaming services, it's using AI when you use Netflix and it recommends hey, here's what I think you might want to watch next, or here's what, based on you watching this, here's what I think you might be interested in. And then we talk about online shopping as well. So recommending you products specifically based on what you've searched in the past or based on what you're even talking about in your day-to-day lives from what your phone can hear, and then kind of recommend those products to you. So I feel like what we do find is that, a lot of people use AI more in their everyday lives than they even realize at times. And I think what I really like to talk about is, where can you use AI right now? Where are some of the opportunities from an investing standpoint? Where are some of the opportunities that's being used the most in everyday business by sectors? And then we'll talk a little bit about some of those opportunities going forward. But, I think the big one to start is advertisement, because I think one of the big concerns you hear about in the marketplace right now is, you have these companies like Google and Meta, and you hear the word CapEx thrown around a lot. Now, that's a big term that's in the industry right now, capital expenditures. And, a lot of this around AI is building out these massive data centers and massive cloud warehouses, all this place that they can store all this technology. But for these companies, at the end of the day, the crux of it is really around advertising. That's the primary way that a lot of these companies are making money through AI use right now, is targeted advertisements. So if we take a look, for example, at Facebook, Facebook launched Meta Advantage a number of years ago. And basically what Meta Advantage is that it's their AI-enabled advertising generative program. So think about something like Instagram. For those of you guys out there who use Instagram or Facebook, when you search something on your phone or you're talking to one of your friends about a product or an opportunity or something something like that, it's really scary, but a lot of times you go, then you open your phone, you open your Instagram account, and you have an advertisement for either that product or something similar to that in the realm. And I think that's the big case of what you're seeing right now is these companies are paying companies like Facebook and Meta massive amounts of money to push their advertisements out to their users. And they're doing it through this program called Meta Advantage. And basically what Facebook has found is that they can generate about $4.52 in revenue for every $1 they spend. That's a 22% increase compared to normal advertising campaigns. And they spend about 50 billion a year on their AI advertisement campaigns and AI advertisement algorithms. So advertising right now is one of the leading ways that these companies you hear about in the market are making money through use of AI. When we look at technology, you look at different areas of technology that you're starting to see automation help. We went back and looked at a 2023 MIT study that found access to AI assistance increased call center productivity by about 14% on average. So that's one way that you're seeing that in the marketplace in technology specifically. And then the last point area I would look to is healthcare. And I think healthcare is going to be one of those huge opportunities out there in the industry in the next couple of years, because what you're looking at is real world use cases where AI can be used to potentially help save lives down the road. Now, we haven't seen a full programmed AI scoped drug come out yet that was fully discovered by AI when it came to testing patients, trials, controls, things like that. But we're definitely moving towards that at some point, and we've seen really strong results. But when we look at healthcare right now, what is really accelerating is in drug discovery and diagnostic reports. So what we did is we went back and we looked at a study, same in 2023, done by the National Institute of Health, and they found that AI algorithms performed as well or better than some of the leading dermatologists in detecting melanoma, which highlights really the potential of AI to enhance diagnostic accuracy and lead to improved patient outcomes. Right now, where we've seen AI in the healthcare space is companies using it to identify the right patients for their trials, the right controls in place, et cetera. But as we continue to move towards the potential for drug discovery through the use of artificial intelligence, that will be one of the major highlights when it comes to the healthcare market.
I think this is such an interesting space. If you think about really, there's a lot of people that are nervous about AI, right? And where it's going to take the world and what's safe and what's not. But the ability to have someone show up and a really rare diagnosis to allow AI to put all that information in and potentially give that information to a doctor that's never experienced it on their own, right? So there's a lot of space in this healthcare space that I think that's the part of the world I think that I'm the most excited about, because that could really, to your point, save lives. Really,
Yeah, 100%. And, it's
near
really as
distance.
simple
Yeah.
as too as just giving your doctor right now even more time to focus on patient outcomes.
Yeah.
If you can use AI right now on some of the administrative side of the business, save your doctor some time there. As we get more towards the use of it for drug discovery, that's going to open up even more doors. But I think healthcare is one of those areas right now where AI has made a big difference in the last couple of years. And then, just finishing, I think I kind of touched on this earlier when I talked about navigation apps. But, when we look at how AI differs from traditional tech, I think the main difference that you want to think about, I think this is something I want to, definitely leave you with is, AI doesn't follow rigid instructions. So it adapts, it learns, and it improves over time, making it more powerful than your traditional software providers. So think of, kind of your traditional software as fixed inputs lead to fixed outputs. You'll always get the same results. So this works really well when you look at something like, a Garmin GPS, as we've talked about. It'll always get you from point A to point B in the best possible manner, and it will help you get to where you need to go. It won't lead you into a lake like we've seen in episodes of The Office. It'll get the job done. But I think as we look at it, AI is probabilistic, excuse me. The outputs vary based on the learning and how the data evolves. So when you combine the data with the AI architecture, it becomes a process similar to a game of like a hot or colder, like a newer GPS on your phone. So not only does it take in real-time traffic data, so it can obviously kind of alter your route based on what's going on with the traffic, accidents, police stoppages, construction, anything like that. But it also, as I mentioned, will learn your habits and start to recommend things. If you have a coffee place on the way to work, it'll recommend that. And so what it really does is it really adopts with the real world in real time, and it consistently alters based on how much you use it. If that's anything, I hope you take away from this is the more you use your AI programming, whatever it is you use, whether it's ChatGPT, Gemini, Anthropic, any of these providers, the more you use it, the more it will start to learn about you, about how you think, how you write, how you read, etc. And it will adopt to try and help you further going forward by just accessing that software on a more consistent basis. So I'll take a pause there. Hopefully, kind of gave you just a good overview of kind of what AI is in general. But really, can see if there's any questions, or can talk a little bit about the tech dominance in the market, why AI has expanded so quickly. Can talk about some of the other investing opportunities. Can really kind of take it wherever we want to go from here. But I guess I'll stop and see if there's any questions that kind of directly relate to what I talked about earlier.
Yeah, so if there's any questions out there, if anyone wants to drop them in, I think the thing that was striking to me about those slides is the 99% of people, right? Half of people or a third of people might think they've used AI, half don't believe they're using AI. I think that this is a really interesting chart because a lot of people don't realize when they're using AI. And so one of the things I would like to kind of talk to a little bit about is, when is it safe? What should you be putting in ChatGPT? What should you be using it for? A lot of times I encourage clients to use it. Like I personally will use it for travel plans.
Yeah.
I went to Banff, Canada last year and said, here's everywhere I want to go. Help me create that layout. But I will tell you, for everyone on this, it said you have to go to Jasper. If you make it to Banff, do the 3-hour drive and go to Jasper. Well, unfortunately, Jasper had burned because of all the wildfires. And so it wasn't time stamped. So it said this is one of the most highly rated things to do. However, AI didn't give me good relevant information there. And so I think that that's one thing that I encourage people to use it for. But do you want to give a couple of examples of where you encourage people to at least start with AI?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think you're spot on. I think travel is a really easy one. What I always like to say to avoid is, avoid personal information. You don't want to be putting things like, credit card numbers, social security numbers, addresses, things like that. Generally, a lot of this information is extremely secure, but like everything that's out there on the internet, there are hackers that are trying to get to anything that's out there, not just AI, but all across the entire internet. So I like to try to be cautious on kind of the personal information you're putting in there. But yeah, I mean, I think travel is a great one that I use it for. I use it a lot for just, market research. And I think that's an easy one for you guys that are out there that are interested in, what's going on in the market. I think you can ask it, usually, and, it's crazy to think about, but, I log in every day and I just ask, anything that happened in the last 12 hours that would be relevant to today's opening of the markets. And it'll kind of scan through anything that happened either in the evening last night here in the US, anything that happened in APAC and Asia and EMEA during their trading hours. So I think that's really a great place to start. That's kind of how I use it for a jumping off point. I use it to ask a lot about companies right now. What companies look attractive from a valuation standpoint? What does this company do that has them competitive in their current landscape? So I think you can use it for all of those sides of things. But yeah, I mean, I definitely think the way that I'll also give you one that I'm using it a lot right now, or my wife seems to be, is something like interior design. We bought a house about 6 months ago. We're going through the process of completely redesigning the whole thing right now, kind of trying to make it all our own. She puts every picture of every one of our rooms into ChatGPT and asks for potential suggestions on furniture, carpets, things to hang on the walls, all of this. And so, I think there's a lot of different areas you can use it that just really help, make some of your everyday life tasks just a little bit easier.
Yeah, I think a good point to that as well is you can use it for a lot of creative things.
Yeah.
If you're using it for something that is sourced, if it's for market data, if it's for travel plans, ask for sources. Because you can really ask and see the legitimacy of this, because we know AI is pulling from a thousand different places. Well, is it accurate if it's on Facebook? right? Where is
Yeah.
this data pulling from, and making sure that you're pulling that data from a legitimate source.
Yeah, I think I mean I think that's a great point. I think the one, the thing I would definitely pay attention to is, especially even as simple as a simple Google search now. Google's done a great job of implementing kind of this high level AI on their search function. So if you go to Google and you search, what is the best restaurant in Banff, it'll give you kind of an automated response right at the top. The big thing to pay attention to that point, Tammy, is there is a gear icon next to all of the responses that it gives you. So if you hover over that and click on it, what that'll do is that'll give you the source that it pulled it from. So you can see, if you're looking for, medical information, you probably want it to come from a reputable medical source. You don't want it to come from Reddit or something like that. So definitely something to pay a lot of attention to as you're using it more in your everyday life.
So we have a question about if anyone's talked about being able to turn AI on or off when you want recommendations. What does that look like if you don't want AI to be part of your life, or listening to you? If you want to be
Yeah.
that one out of 100, how do you get to that point for even for a moment of time?
Yeah, the big thing, so especially if you're worried about like your iPhone, what you can do is in individual apps, you can go into your settings on the app and you can turn off the microphone function. And so basically what that'll do is, it'll turn off the microphone function from essentially listening to your conversations, as you're using these various apps. So I would say that's probably the biggest way to do it. Especially, I think you can do it overall for your iPhone as well, just through your general settings. So if you kind of navigate to that microphone app, and you can kind of tell it when you would want your phone to be listening to you, whether that's when you're using the app, never, always, anything. So you can kind of control some of those settings right there. So that's the big one I would say. And then, I think the other one for me is, I think the other thing is, I don't use a large language model like a Chat GPT or a Copilot for everything in my life. A lot of things, as we mentioned, I just use my standard Google search. And in a lot of that area, you're kind of getting the old school search function that you used to have. It's not as much studying your tendencies, especially if you're just generally on Google and you're not specifically signed in to your Google account from there.
Perfect. Well, why don't we take this chance to kind of transition to kind of the next portion, about maybe a little bit more about investing in AI and what this really means.
Yeah, of course. So, I always like to start, and I'll kind of take a step back, and just looking at tech in general. Obviously, tech is kind of everything that's out there in the industry right now. Everyone wants to talk about technology, the growth of AI, large language models, semiconductor chips, everything, and really a lot of that is just based on the sheer size of tech. And this is actually a little bit old. This is the end of 2024. If you look at this at the end of 2025, what you would see is that technology carries almost an over $20 trillion market cap in the S&P 500. So what does that mean? It's bigger than the next two sectors combined. And I think what makes that even more interesting is the second largest sector is comm services, communication services. The two largest companies in communication services are Alphabet, Google, and Meta, Facebook. And so I think if you even took those two, which are really tech companies at the end of the day, and slid them in, you'd be talking about a $25 trillion market cap for technology. So, it's no surprise that tech has dominated a lot of the market headlines for recent periods. And, AI has really become kind of the focal point of that because of how quick it's adopted to the American household. And so when you look at this, we went back and we looked at, past tech cycles. So specifically the PC and the internet. What you can see here is that it took the PC about 12 years to reach 40% of US homes. It took the internet about 5 years to reach 40% of US homes. It's taken AI just two. And the reason behind that is, at its core, AI is a piggyback on top of the internet and the PC. You wouldn't be able to use some of these AI functions without access to the internet and without having, the standard hardware to get access to that program, whether that's your iPhone, whether that's your laptop, whether that's your desktop computer at work, anything like that, your iPad, tablets, anything. It takes that experience to be able to access your AI programming. So, we've seen AI really rapidly adopt across the market. And I think when we look at as a growth driver, this is something that's really key to what we're looking at right now, because as we've looked at past tech cycles, the way that we look at it is, in order for, AI or anything, any past cycles to really generate higher GDP, you need one of two things. You need either higher productivity. So that's, either more workers or more efficient workers really at the end of the day. And so really what we've seen is post Great Depression, we saw higher productivity when you saw, the electricity, combustion engine, chemicals, telecommunication. Post World War II, we saw higher productivity because of the population boom. You had all the soldiers returning home from the war, coming back to work. Turn of the century, we saw higher productivity because of the adoption of information technology and the internet. But really, what we've seen is post GFC to now, we've actually seen a lower productivity environment. So we've seen slower demographic growth, we've seen lower innovation, and we've already seen high productivity in the workplace. When you look at the amount of people that are filing for jobs out there, it hasn't increased dramatically. A lot of people continue to work. It's just we haven't gotten to this, higher productivity. And what you need in order to access that now is innovation. And that's really what AI at the end of the day is when you talk about, a productivity boost through this innovation in the market, through the ability to work smarter. I think a quote that really sticks out to me is from Jensen Huang, who's the CEO of NVIDIA. We actually had him in our office a couple months ago, and he shared a quote that I thought really, really stuck out, and I've used in a lot of my client meetings. But he said, AI isn't going to take your job, but someone who's better at using AI might. And I think that's the core of it at this time is, you're not going to get your jobs replaced by AI, but there are people, whether they're, depending on their demographic, they could be younger, they could be older, they could be coming from outside of your industry. But, these people that are more effective at using AI and can help save on their day to day is really something that's going to be impactful in the workplace. I just talked with one of our lead portfolio managers last week, and he said that his use of AI has saved him about 16% in the last year when it came to administrative tasks that he would have to do on a day-to-day basis. So that meant for him that he was able to put 16% more time in researching companies, which led to him being one of the best portfolio managers in his space last year. And so I think that's a huge example of how using AI in your everyday life can really help from a productivity standpoint and kind of help, generate more efficient outcomes. But I think to your point, Tammy, it's not all, all good. There is some risk out there in the market. And so, we took a couple different surveys and we looked at, 72% of Americans believe that AI will negatively affect the spread of false information. 60% believe that it will negatively impact individual opportunities to get good jobs. And 56% believe that it will have a negative effect on national security. So, there's not just all of this good with AI. I think what we've talked about, earlier on this call in terms of making sure you're protecting your information, making sure you're being prudent about how you use your program, asking the right questions, doing all of the right things is really the key in the market because, as AI gets more impactful on our everyday lives, there are also other people that are looking to use it for a negative aspect. So I think that's one of the key factors when you're talking about AI use is, making sure that you're using it in the right way, in the right manner, because I think when you do see that, it can open up a lot of investment opportunities. And so what we did here is we looked at, from AI investing, what are investors looking for? And so when you see from a Google search trend, you can see, AI stocks to buy versus technology stocks to buy. And AI is in the dark blue. You can see, starting in 2023, really this skew between looking for tech stocks to buy and looking for AI stocks to buy specifically. And I think one of the most difficult things for that is a lot of these AI companies are private. So these are private companies that makes it a little bit harder to access them. But I think what we want to know and what we want to let investors know is that there's still so much opportunity out in the private markets to play AI. And it doesn't just have to be through technology companies. So when you look at spaces like infrastructure, you'll hear a lot about that in the industry coming up. AI has really increased the demand for data center energy, and it's going to require a massive infrastructure investment into things like HVAC and coolings, electrical grid systems, buildings and warehousing, and construction and technical labor. I was recently reading a stat last week that told me that the U.S. is estimated, I think, in the next 2 years to have be short 500,000 electricians. Excuse me. So when you talk about this data center rollout and all the projects that are coming, we have a massive shortage of electricians here in the U.S. And I think you're going to see that industry really take off. Electricians will be able to start charging significantly higher prices for their capabilities because of the massive amount of demand that they're under. And I think it really starts all by this data center theme. And so what we did is we looked at here the data center expansion across the country. You can see that AI's economic impact impact has grown, outside of just the Silicon Valley tech boom to infrastructure across the entire country. And I think this really opens up a lot of eyes because you see, obviously California is one of the largest concentrations of data centers, but you see a lot of states out there that are really heavily impacted by this trade, especially in kind of the mid-Atlantic, Midwestern part of the country here. A state like Virginia, people didn't realize, has the highest concentration of data centers in the entire country right now. And so there's a lot of opportunity for alternative sources of energy, for infrastructure investing, for electricians, for plumbing, anything like that. To get these facilities off the ground. And I think there's a lot of investment opportunity, not just the technology companies. And it really starts and ends right now with the U.S. When you look at U.S. stock market performance, you can see, the U.S. leads in tech innovation, driving domestic AI boom despite global competition from other countries, specifically China. But when you look at, this is as of March 2025. So this has probably gone up a little bit, but the U.S. has 55 global technology countries with a net income of greater than $1 billion. That's more than every other country in the world combined right now. And so the U.S. has been the clear leader when it comes to investing around technology. But I think we are starting to see some of these other countries, specifically out of the APAC region, with Japan, China, Taiwan, Korea. All of these countries are taking more shape on investing in technology from a global landscape. But it does continue to be, the U.S. as the primary opportunity around the AI investment theme right now.
I mean, that is an amazing stat right there. It's unbelievable what the United States and what we have the ability to do. I mean, just here locally, it's incredible.
Yeah, and I think no matter what political party you support, I think it is it's eye opening to see that no matter who comes in, whether it's former presidents, current administration, they recognize that the asset class that we need to protect and we need to continue to be a winner in is technology, because of the importance of kind of being that early AI adopter and being the leader in that capability, relative to some of the other major countries that are out there.
I like that slide. There's so many ways, as AI became a thing, most people thought, oh, this is a new thing that's coming into the world. Well, in reality, this has been building for years and years, right? To your point, it's layering on with technology, but the ways that AI is going to affect the day to day, as far as the energy, the infrastructure, all of these parts of AI that are really just continuing to help multiple different sectors grow. Healthcare, right? That was a big one that we talked about. It's interesting. It doesn't have to be NVIDIA, right? It doesn't have to be ChatGPT. There's a lot of different ways that you're getting the benefits of AI without, quite frankly, even realizing it. One
Yeah.
other question: when will we get self-driving cars or robo taxis?
Interesting one. I have this debate a lot. I was down with my parents for Memorial Day weekend, and my wife and I just got married about a year ago. So thinking about that conversation about having kids, and my dad and I got in this conversation and a little bit of a spirited debate about whether when we had a kid, whether or not he or she would ever drive a car. And I think that is such an interesting thing to think about. We're seeing it more and more already. So for those of you guys who have visited, I would say some of those warmer tech-centric spots, San Francisco, Phoenix and Scottsdale, Austin, they have access to what Waymo is kind of the leader right now from a self-driving taxi standpoint. Tesla's obviously trying to make inroads there with their strategies as well. But, we've seen some of those capabilities already. I've had the pleasure of taking a few different Waymos in San Francisco and in Phoenix as well. I've enjoyed the experience. I know there's been some recent developments, especially in some of the areas that have flooded recently around some issues with the cars navigating that. And so I think those are the big things right now, is kind of figuring out, one, how do we scale it? And two, how do we scale it to different markets? I'm in Boston. I've lived in Boston my entire life pretty much. I know that when the roads get bad, only the good drivers kind of come out to play. And so, I know you guys are in an area where there's some snow as well. And so, I think that's the big question is kind of figuring out, how do these automated cars deal with adverse weather conditions, deal with, roads that are a little bit set up, kind of old school in Northeast here, old infrastructure, things like that. But I would say, if we think about it, we are probably a couple years out from definitely more scalability on the autonomous driving side. It's definitely coming sooner rather than later. I know Waymo is testing in a number of different markets, including Boston right now. So they are looking to actively expand. I think the question then becomes, when do you get kind of, the everyday driver in a strategy like buying a car that is self-driving? I think that's probably further out down the line, but I think we'll see more scalability for self-driving vehicles, specifically on the rideshare taxi side, in the next couple of years for sure.
Fascinating. All right, one more question for you. So, since the AI focused stocks are at high levels, what are the supportive sectors or companies that will be part of the next AI growth as far as stock value?
Yeah, I mean, I think the big one right now is financials. So you look at the way that the banks are going to be able to use AI a little bit more in their everyday lives, based a lot from fraud protection, things like that, security. Using some of that programming is a way where I think you'll see a lot of success, on the AI side, in the financial space. It's not just all tech that's been good. Software is an area that's been beat up pretty significantly. I think you'll start to see some of these companies that are able to utilize software more in their everyday lives start to take advantage of it. But I think the big one that we're paying a lot of attention to is the consumer businesses. I think Walmart's a great example. Walmart has kind of rolled out Sparky, which is kind of their AI tool that you can use. And I've sat in a number of meetings with them. And I think one that I sat in was really cool is, what you can do and what you'll be able to do through AI through their program is, let's say you go on and you say, I want to make a recipe tonight, something that I haven't made in a while or haven't made ever. And you go to, whatever is your cookbook or on the internet and you find a recipe. What you can do is you can go to Walmart's AI Sparky program. You can drop that recipe into their AI algorithm. It will automatically order you all of the ingredients that you need for that recipe. You can tell it, if you have something. So if you have like olive oil or something like that, you can take it out. But it'll automatically order all of the ingredients you don't have that you need for automated pickup. You can go to the store and just pick it up and go. And so you don't have to do the shopping. You can drop in that recipe. And I think that's a simple way that, they're using it to make their clients' lives easier. I talked about eBay. Something like eBay and Facebook Marketplace. The worst things about those is dealing with the people. You put the listing up, someone responds and says, "Hey, is this still available?" You say yes. You never hear from them again. You do that 100 times, and eventually someone comes to pick up the item from your house. But I think when you look at, eBay is a great program where, they've developed this AI agent. So they'll help you even list the item. You just take a picture of it, you send it to them. Their AI program will write you a description of the item. It'll recommend a price for you. It'll get it listed. It'll handle all of your conversations with potential buyers. Then it'll bring you in at the last minute when you get an offer that's close or asking for what you need, and see if you want to accept it, and then ship out the item from there. So I think the retail side is really where you're seeing a lot of AI use cases as well, which has done really well for a lot of these businesses.
I think it's so interesting. We have a chart in our book currently that's the top 10 companies by decade. And you look at the top 10 companies today, heavy AI focused. Are those 10 companies going to be the same 10 companies in 2035? Probably not. But, it's interesting. I was looking at this actually with our new interns the other day and going back to 1985, and Kodak was the
Oh, yeah.
top 10 company. And I said, "Do you even know what Kodak is? Like, do you know what that company did?" And it's fascinating. This is really a point in time where the companies that buy in, that understand AI, that continue to be Walmart and, use AI to their benefit, I think it's going to be a huge shift in their efficiencies and, if they really even exist 10 years from now. Thank you to everyone for joining us for this Cook Financial Group in the Bullpen session on AI. Matt, it was such a pleasure.
Yeah, thank
Always
you.
great to see you. Thank you for your time today. And thank you to everyone for joining us.